So I'm going to talk a little bit about gradients, how to create them. They're fairly easy to create, and how to manipulate and change them, and also converting text to objects that we can edit through Illustrator. So first we have two basic shapes here. I'm going to move this over because we'll deal with that one in a second. So we have just our regular old square filled with a solid black. I'm going to actually select it. And you'll see in your swatches palette, you have a few different gradients. Well, that's a pattern. But you'll see a few different gradients. And then like any other, almost any other thing in Illustrator, we have our libraries. I don't know if I showed you this earlier in the semester, but under libraries, you have a whole bunch of brush libraries, graphic libraries, swatch libraries, symbol libraries, which you get into some of that more later. But under our swatch libraries, you'll see you have a ton of different libraries, and one, oops, if I can actually get to it, conveniently called gradients, to where you have a whole bunch of different crazy types of gradients. I wanted to get into metals. So you see it brings up this nice palette with all these different metals. So you have golds and silvers and chrome and all that fun stuff. And you can also create your own gradients. I'm just going to go back a couple steps. I just wanted to show you those swatch libraries. So if you had, like the assignment takes us through, if you have a gradient that's somewhat close, like this is a 3-color gradient, as we hover over here, a 3-color gradient, and as you hover over, most of the default ones have pretty sort of self-explanatory names. And you want to change these colors out or adjust these colors, you can easily do so. Either, let's get our gradient window open under window and gradient. So you see we have kind of like our color here. We have all types of different options for the gradients, and you'll see our sliders here, and then different opacities and locations for your color sliders, and the type of gradient as well. So right now we have a linear gradient, 3 colors. You can change your gradient to a radial gradient, which is fairly self-explanatory. It starts from the middle out, from left to right. So we have yellow in the middle, and then here, so when you adjust, oops, I just created a new one. When you adjust your slider, you'll see, and I do that a lot, where I accidentally create new gradients, or new color stops. So the things here that I'm adjusting, which is what I wanted to show you here, are called your color stops. And they're basically sliders that allow you to adjust your gradients. You know, let's say that you wanted this orange a little bit brighter. So you have your color stops, and then you have the gradient, the gradation, or the fade between the two colors. So if you wanted it to be a little bit more orange, you can move this slider out so you have a little bit more orange, and it kind of previews a little bit too. And you'll see, it's kind of hard to see here, but the location changed. So it tells you it's 33% in between these two. So if you wanted to type a specific number, even 25%, it's kind of hard to show all that and move the mouse at the same time. Let me go back to this. So if you wanted to set certain locations for these sliders, like if you knew you wanted that to be 25% between the orange and the yellow, then you could just type in 25%, or you know, even 10%, and you can see there's barely any yellow in there, and it's mostly orange fading into, there's a little bit of a nice softer gradient from the orange to the blue. So when you adjust gradients like this, you have to keep in mind, like you see now, the gradient is, try to explain this without like over confusing it. Like, see how it's a lot softer since you have a little bit more range between the orange and the blue, and then it's a little bit harder here because you have so much orange, because you have the gradient is only at like 10% of yellow, so the gradient is going to appear a little bit harder, for lack of a better word. Like, it's not going to feather out as much, right? So if we put this back to 50%, now you'll see that gradient between the orange and the yellow is a lot softer, and then you have your orange, and then the gradient between the blue and the orange is nice and soft with the feather. So that's how you adjust the blend between the gradients. Again, you can adjust your sliders or type in the numbers here. You can also adjust, I know I showed it very quickly, but you can also adjust the colors where they fall. And if you have a specific location like this one, you want it to be right in the middle, so we'll hit 50%, or if you wanted this to be at 75 for whatever reason, you can adjust that along the spectrum, along your slider. If you want to change colors, so like I was saying at the beginning, so let's say you have this 3-color gradient that you want to use. We'll go back to linear, and you can see as you change these, it's a little bit easier to see when you're in a linear gradient rather than a radial gradient, but you'll see the blends obviously shift and change. I feel like with a linear gradient, you still have a nice soft blend between the two colors. Even though you set your blend, let's go back to like 10% or give or take. It's only at like the blend here between the yellow and the orange is only like 13% rather. But you'll see that that blend is still like fairly soft. It's not as harsh when you have a radial gradient. A lot of times you get those when you have when you have a blend that's tighter to a color, one way or the other. With a radial gradient, it gets a little bit like you have a harder line rather than a nice feather. Let's bring that back to 50. So let's say you wanted a 3-color gradient. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll pick one that I know with 3 colors, and then if I want to change these colors, you can. There's a few different ways to do it, like is everything in Illustrator. The easiest way is to click on that color slider that you want to change. So let's say we wanted to make this, and then you can click your swatches here. When you double click, it brings up this color palette, which is basically this representation of your default swatches. It shows you what color you're currently on, and then you have all of your other swatch options. So let's say this is going to be gross, but let's change this one to green, and then you can also change the opacity of the color as well if you wanted to bring it down to like a 30% opacity. So not only do you have your gradient, but you also have it grading to this green at like 30% opacity. We're going to leave that at 100 for now. And then let's say we wanted to change this middle one to a more sort of bricky red. And just for argument's sake, we want to change this yellow one to like a bluish on the side of purple. So you can change the colors fairly easily just by double clicking your gradient sliders. And you can also pick a custom color if you knew a mix that you wanted to use, if you had a specific mix, or you can use the color picker here as well. I honestly find it easiest just to use the swatches, unless I know a specific color mix that I want to use. To add color sliders, like let's say you wanted to change this to a 5-color gradient. You saw me in the beginning of the demo do it by accident very easily. all you need to do is just kind of generally hover in this area, and you'll see that little plus sign come up, and that allows you to add a slider. And I'm just going to add a slider here. And it's very easy. Again, as you saw, it's very easy to do it by accident. So it kind of automatically defaults to pick a color between, give or take, between the two colors you have selected. And again, let's say we wanted to change this to a yellow. This color actually isn't too bad. Well, not that this is very pretty, but so you can change the color. Again, you can. It acts like any other slider. You can adjust it. You can adjust the blend between the two colors, all that fun stuff. Like I said in the beginning of the demo, if you accidentally add a color, which I do all the time, because you kind of just have to generally hover, and it's easy to, let's undo that. Let's say I wanted to, what I did in the beginning is I wanted to grab this one and move it just to show you moving the slider. And if you're just a little bit off, it's easy to create, it's easy to create another slider. To get rid of a slider, all you do is you grab that slider, you click and hold your mouse and just drag down, and you see it just kind of disappears. Again, I create extra sliders all the time by accident. So let's say we wanted to get rid of this yellow one and leave this a four color gradient, and then give or take have these about more evenly spread. Now we've created a 4-color gradient. You may also use, on the left side of our palette here, I was waiting for my smart label to come up, but it didn't, your gradient tool. And you'll see when you click on the gradient tool, we get this line that pops up showing us where our gradient is. You can adjust the gradient, I want to say manually, but that's not the right word, but somewhat manually. So you can pull out that you can pull out the gradient if you wanted it to be, you know, the green to barely show. You basically pull your gradient line just past where you want it to show. And now this doesn't adjust the gradient itself, like where the position of the sliders or things are. It just adjusts where the gradient falls within your object, right? So let's say we pull this like way out, and it pretty much just looks like a 2-color gradient here, because all we're seeing pretty much is basically the gradient to about here, give or take. And as you hover over, you see you get your representation of the gradient slider. Oops. As you hover over that tool, and you can also adjust your sliders. But you can see the gradient hasn't changed at all. You can see it still looks pretty much the same way it does here. It's just you've changed the position of where it falls within your object. Let's bring it back to basically the edge there. You can also rotate your gradient. Which I always have trouble doing. You can move your gradient. And reposition it. You can also, if you wanted to sort of angle your gradient at a particular angle, instead of just, if you knew, you know, let's say we wanted this to be 45 degrees, we have 45, or if you wanted it to go a little bit softer from corner to corner, you can also click and drag generally where you want your gradient to fall, and how short, I guess, or how wide you drag your gradient, again, is going to position it within that object. It basically defaults, when you just fill, it defaults to just pretty much go edge to edge and fill whatever object you're filling with a gradient. And you can also go by direction. If you went from right to left like I just did, it basically flips your gradient, and you can hold shift as well to to keep everything nice and straight in line. So you can flip your gradient this way. You can also flip your gradient here, or reverse your gradient here as well. To use your gradient tool, again, there's a bunch of different ways to do the same thing. You know, if you wanted to go from left to right, from right to left, you just draw that way. And you'll see that the angle has changed here as well. So that's essentially playing with gradients. It's fairly easy. Like I said, there's a whole bunch of preset swatches. A lot of times I'll just grab a swatch and manipulate it rather than creating it from scratch. You certainly can create it from scratch. It generally remembers the last fill that you had. But usually if you're going to adjust with the gradient tool, you already have it filled with a gradient swatch. So basically, yeah, again, adjusting gradients, you can adjust your sliders in your gradient palette, adjust all your angles, the type, reverse, or you can use the gradient tool. And again, as you hover over, you have your stops at the top, or your blends at the top and your stops at the bottom. And you can kind of see, as I zoom in a little bit, as I'm sort of towards the bottom of our gradient there, that little plus comes up to add or delete, stops or add stops, as you wish. And you'll see there's a couple other options here for gradients on a stroke, which you can also do. They work a little bit differently, which is why we have this object with a crazy stroke on it. They work a little bit differently. You want to make sure that you're on your stroke. And you can fill your gradient, or you can fill your stroke rather, with a gradient, and you can see that it goes around, essentially around the gradient. What it does is it fills similar to an object, so you can see it goes from left to right, yellow to blue. And here's where you have your options for, let's zoom in again, for your gradients. I was hoping that would pop up. So this applies the gradient to the whole object. This applies the gradient along the stroke. And then this applies the gradient across the stroke, and I'll show you the difference between the two. So again, within the stroke, basically you can see it handles similar to filling an object. It pretty much just goes from left to right or right to left. Filling it along the stroke, you can see it starts basically where your first anchor point was. So it starts and goes around the stroke rather than sort of blending from left to right. And then this across the stroke basically goes from the outside of the stroke to the inside of the stroke. And you can also, again, flip, adjust as you want, just like a fill gradient. You can have the direction when it's along the stroke. You can also flip the direction that you want your gradient to start and stop at. And again, you still have the same options if you wanted to create another color. And let's make that something obnoxious that we can see. There we go. And you can see we have another color here represented. When it's across the stroke, it's not too bad. I was going to say it's a little bit trickier to see, but I picked a nice obnoxious color, so it's not exactly tricky to see. If you have a lot of colors along the stroke and your stroke isn't like humongous too, you can see that it gets kind of crowded very quickly. Question? Was there a question or no? Oh, sorry. I thought I saw your hand go up. So there are similar options. Again, you can adjust. I'm just kind of undoing. So you can adjust and add add color stops, and adjust your blend, your gradient sliders, just like you would in a fill object, but depending on how you have the gradient interact with the stroke, obviously it appears differently. And then lastly, applying gradients to text. Let's grab, for the purposes of this assignment, going back to our berry, and I'm not going to kern this, and I'm just going to grab there we go. I just wanted to grab a serifed font. So applying a gradient to text handles a little bit differently. Obviously you can change the fill of the text to pretty much whatever color you want. Until we get to gradients, you cannot apply a gradient to editable type. So what you need to do is, let's go back to black here, and then I just want to see, yeah, and you can't do it with a stroke either. You can see it shows that it has a stroke, that has a gradient stroke on it, but then it shows as black, right? So what you need to do is you need to convert your text into an object, which is super easy to do. You go under Type and Create Outlines, or Shift Command O for outlines. And then now you see that baseline disappeared, and our bounding box is just around the bounds of the letters themselves, because now this is an object that we can fill with a gradient. Now by default, this is where, not that it gets tricky, but you can see by default it sort of filled each letter with our gradient, right? So this is where our gradient tool comes in handy. And let's say we want it to go generally across the entire word. So this is where we're going to start, give or take, at the end of the B. And I'm just holding shift so it stays relatively in the middle here. And then I'm just dragging my gradient across all of the objects that we want to fill. In this case, the letters that we outlined. And now you have the gradient go across all of the letters rather than fill each of the letters individually. You can also, oops, I keep wanting to go to that scale tool. You can also have it go vertically. So you get this cute little sunset-ish kind of look. So this is where that gradient tool comes in handy for applying gradients across multiple objects, which basically this is. Creating outlines, not only for working with gradients, but creating outlines is something that's super, super handy. I do all the time when I am creating logos or anything like that, pretty much anything involving text and print. When I'm done with it, I create outlines so that way there's no font issues for any printers or that to potentially happen because there's no fonts, right? The sort of plus is, or the pro, I guess, is that you can manipulate the text now a variety of different ways that you couldn't when it was just text. The drawback is, let's say you wanted to change this to berries, you kind of have to go back because now this isn't editable text anymore. So you would have to go back to when it was text. What I generally do whenever I'm designing, and I should pull this up just to show you, but when I'm designing and I have text and I know I'm going to potentially outline it, or I am going to outline it later, I'll do our option copy, and I'll just kind of copy a text version somewhere off in my free space. And then this way, if I create outlines and do our thing with it, blah, 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 and then we decide that we want to change this to berries, then I can just go back, and then I have this, so I don't have to pick the font, I don't have to match, I don't have to go matching it up, I still leave this editable version, and then I copy this to my drawing board, and et cetera, et cetera. So you'll see, again, I have I'll show you my drawing. My free space or scratch area, whatever you want to call it, is usually a mess when I'm designing. So that's the drawback, the only drawback really, to creating, as far as output, for creating outlines. And even if you don't fill with gradients, excuse me, even if you don't fill with gradients or anything like that, even if you have just text that you leave solid, again, whenever I'm done sort of manipulating that text, I always create outlines, again, so that way there's no font issues to have because there's no fonts in the file. I'm not sure if I can quickly show you what I mean there. No, it's not there. I'll pull it up. I'll pull it up next class and show you my messy drawing boards. So that's basically applying gradients to text, which are technically not applying it to text because you're applying it to an object, to outline text, which is not type anymore. It also works the same way. Let's say I'm just going to fill that where. I'm just going to make a copy of a couple of these. So in a similar way, this handles just like the text does. If you want to have a gradient go across these objects, I'm going to select these 4 squares. And as we hit the gradient swatch, again, you'll see it fills it in a similar way. It fills each object with the gradient. And if we want it to go across all of the objects, go back to our gradient tool, and then you'll see our little slider pops up in every single window. So instead, I'm going to go across all of the objects. And now our gradient goes from object to object, right? And you can do that with pretty much any amount of objects. So whatever objects you have selected, and decide to have that gradient tool go across to manipulate. Again, let's say if we wanted to go from top to bottom, generally in the middle, and I'm going just from top to bottom. Now, obviously, it looks a little bit different than having the berry, but this doesn't look much different than flipping our gradient 90 degrees, but you get the idea. If you wanted it to go across multiple objects, again, just to sort of beat it to the ground. There we go. Now we have our gradient going across all 4 objects instead of just filled within each object as a default fill. The last thing I wanted to show you was adding a drop shadow. Let's go back to our berry here, and I'm going to have this go here. So depending on the colors that you choose or that you have for your gradients, you can see that if you have a nice light color, obviously this isn't crazy light, but you'll fill your berry with a more metallic looking gradient to where there's some whites and some grays in there, and so they kind of drop off and disappear. Like some of the edges sort of drop off. A quick, super handy trick that you see all the time is creating a simple drop shadow. And one of the super simple ways to do it is select your object, and I'm going to use the commands here. I'm going to copy, and then with this object still selected, I'm going to do a paste in back, which I know we've done. I'm going to paste it in back, so now we have the object selected, our berry selected, and pasted in the back behind the original berry. And I'm just going to nudge it over using my arrow keys, like 3 clicks over to the right and 3 clicks down. And I'm just going to fill that with black. And now we've created a drop shadow. So it kind of pops out a little bit more, gives it, a little bit of depth. It's a super old illustration trick. The other thing you can do too is what I'll do often is if I'm adding a drop shadow, I'll actually put a little stroke in the same color as my drop shadow, and I'll generally leave it pretty thin just to kind of have those edges pop out a little bit. And again, using those arrow keys, you can have it be super subtle or super wide, depending on how you want it to look. Generally, you won't have it be that far, but I just wanted to show you, like, if you really wanted to have it to have that drop shadow be generally away. With a serif font, you basically, somewhat as a rule, you kind of don't want to have too much white space, or any at all really, in a drop shadow, because you want it to be somewhat subtle. But yeah, adding a drop shadow is super easy. Rather than adding like a feather drop shadow, kind of like you do in Photoshop, which we'll get into later, you can do in Illustrator. You can add an effect, but that's a little bit different. This is more of just a vector object creating a drop shadow. Again, all you do is you're just simply copying, and I'm just doing the commands, Command C and Command B for paste and back. And we're just filling that. Oops, helps if I actually fill the object rather than the stroke. And you can see now we have a drop shadow on our square. So you're just copying and pasting behind and nudging it a little bit with your arrow keys, and then here you have a drop shadow. So that helps a lot with gradients, and you'll see as we get into the assignment, again, it's filled with, the gradient is filled, the gradient you use rather is like a steel gradient, I think it's called, and you have like some grays and whites, some gradients between some grays and whites, so you get a lot of dropout if you didn't have the drop shadow, where the whites, you would lose your edges where it's obviously white on white. So they have you create this drop shadow to help pop out the letters and make the letters more solid in appearance.